Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're glad that you're here. If you're joining us online, in the room, wherever you are, we're grateful. And if it's your first time, special shout out to you. Welcome to you. Thanks for coming and being a part of things here. You know, there's a question that we ask. Different situations, circumstances in life, and people ask this question pretty often, actually. The question is, was it worth it? Was it worth it? So, like, for example, I remember I was in, I think, college at the time, and I went to Cedar Point, which is the capital of the roller coaster world, right? Like, if you've ever been to Cedar Point in Ohio, it's crazy. They've got all kinds of roller coasters at Cedar Point, and I was there for the very first month when they launched the Top Thrill Dragster. The Top Thrill Dragster at the time was the fastest, highest, craziest roller coaster that had ever been conceived or created. And my friend and I got there, and the line was like 3 hours long, and we had to go. I mean, it was crazy. This roller coaster, you go 0 to 120 miles an hour in like 3.5 seconds. You go 420 feet up in the air, and then turn right back down, and you go back down the other direction. In fact, you know, it was so good, and we waited 3 hours. I had to get the photo at the end of it. So here's me on Top Thrill Dragster. Yeah, that's me and my friend. And then I think we can zoom in, and you can see, yeah, that's pretty good, right? And I'll never forget, I'm getting off the ride, Top Thrill Dragster. It was so crazy, and it was just as good as my face looks right there. And 3 hours later, and someone came up, you know, as I was getting off the ride, and they're looking at the line, and it says 3 hours long, and they ask, was it worth it? Was it worth it? And I said, of course it was worth it. Look at this picture. It was amazing. But we get asked this all the time. We ask this question all the time. Was it worth it? Someone orders the dessert, and, you know, was it worth the calories? You know, sometimes maybe someone wins the Olympics, and they've been training for years and years, and all the sweat and all the dedication and all the sacrifice. And what's the first question so often that someone asks? The reporter gets up to someone who just won the Olympics. They put the microphone in their face, and they say, so was it worth it? All the sacrifice, was it worth it? And I think this is a question that is actually under the surface of all of our lives. We look back on situations and circumstances. We look back on our whole life, actually, and we ask the question, was it worth it? Or maybe another way to say is, what is worth it in our lives? In other words, what's worthy of giving our lives to? Aren't we all asking that really kind of underneath the surface of our lives? And in this series, we're going to take a look at something together. We're in a series entitled Worthy. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of, spoiler alert, give you the punchline to the series here as we kick things off. The premise of the entire series is that there's one thing, and one thing only, that's worthy of giving our entire lives to, and that's the one true living God. There's only one thing that should reorient our lives, change our focus and our priorities, and that should be the one true living God. There's only one thing that if you live your whole life for God, that you're going to look back and you're going to say, it was worth it. 1,000 times, yes, it was worth it. And so we're going to start this series, and we're going to take a look at worship over the next 3 weeks together, and we're going to understand it in a deeper way, a more comprehensive way. And we're going to start today, and we kind of have to start, if we're going to look at worship for the next couple weeks, we're going to have to start with this question: what is worship? What is worship? Because we talk about it a lot, but do we really know? And so that's the topic for today. And I want us to get to the point at the end of this where we have a deeper appreciation, a bigger picture of what worship is, and that it's compelling to us. Because worship is not just the 3 songs that we sing at the beginning of a worship service, right? It's not just, you know, a genre of music on Spotify or whatever. Because worship is the thing about what we're willing to give our life to. It's what's worthy of giving our life to. And so let's answer this question. Definition. I'm using Tim Keller's definition of worship. He says it like this: worship is the act of ascribing ultimate value to something in a way that energizes and engages your whole person. Ultimate value. There's a worth to the thing that we're giving our lives to, and it's worth giving your whole person, your whole being to. In other words, this is not a halfway thing. It's not a half-hearted thing. This is not like, I kind of am going to give some of my time, but I kind of want to hold something back. It's something that we're going to reorient our lives towards. It's something that has so much worth, has so much value that it's worth giving everything to. And we have this ultimate value in mind. And so maybe you're here today and you're thinking to yourself, wow, we're going to talk about worship for 3 weeks. And if you're here and you're thinking, I'm not really like a church Jesus person, I'm not like a worshiper. Maybe you would say, I'm not a Christian. Really, I'm not really sure about Christianity, so I don't really have anything to do with worship. This series is not for me. I would just say, time out for a second, because everyone, yes, everyone is worshiping something in their lives, whether they realize it or not. Worship is not a religious thing. It's like a human thing, right? We all give our lives to something. We all place our value in something. We all live our lives like something in our life is the most important thing in the universe. And so the question isn't if you're going to worship. The question is, what are you going to worship? That's the question that we all have to answer in our lives. What are you going to worship? And what you're worshiping, is it really worthy of giving your life to? At the end of the day, that you would look back and say, it was worth it 1,000 times, yes. And so what we're going to look at together today is what's oftentimes considered kind of the penultimate passage when it comes to worship. We're going to take a look at Psalm 95. And this is a passage that really gives us a picture and answer of the question, what is worship? So we're going to walk through this passage together, and it gives us this holistic picture of worship. And as we look at Psalm 95, there's external actions, but it also talks about the internal things, what's happening in our hearts, and what it means to worship, not just at a surface level. Yes, the actions, what does that look like? But inside in our hearts and in our souls, what does that look like? What is worship? And so it's pretty easy to track through this passage. There's 3 major sections or 3 major stanzas that we look at as we look at this passage. And each one, it has a focus of the stanza, the section that we're going to look at. The first one is God is great, and that means that worship is like the sense of awe. That's the first section. And then second, God is personal, and that means worship is love. And then the third one is it kind of gets into the sense that God is great and God is personal, but God is holy, and that means that we should give him our wholehearted worship. And so let's look at this first one, God is great and worship. That means that we should respond, and worship looks like awe. And so there's this sense as we read this passage in Psalm 95, starting in verse 1, where the psalmist is looking at these attributes of who God is, and he's just, the writer of Psalms is so blown away that they kind of look back and they're just like, in awe. So let's look at this together. Verse 1 says this, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King, above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth. In his hands are the depth of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land." Maybe the single thing that we can do as we're starting this series together and we're understanding what worship is together is we have to start with who God is. We have to start with who God is and have a clear picture of who God is, because if we're reminded of who God is, it's going to remind us why he's worthy to worship. And when we understand that, it changes our perspective about the world. But it's so easy for us to forget who God is, to forget who it is that we're coming to connect with, and who it is that's in the room even in this very moment. In fact, one of the problems with church today is that so often it's easy for us to kind of domesticate God. We kind of fit him into our box. God is small. God is kind of fits into my ideas and my framework of understanding my life. And if your view of God is small, then your worship is going to be small. But if your view of God is really big, then your worship is going to be big in response to who God is. And Psalm 95 frames God in a way that reminds us, as we read this, who it is that we're here to worship in this place. And it gives us this beautiful picture of who God is. And it talks about that God is great. And he gives us all these reasons for why God is great. The first one, it talks about that he is the king. He is the great king. He is like the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He reigns over all of creation. And it doesn't matter what politician you're talking about, all of them fall under the lordship of the one true king. And then in verse 4, it kind of moves into that, he's a king, but he's also creator. He's the creator of the universe, the stars in the sky. He set them in motion. And that everything that we see God created, and I love this picture in this passage. It's almost like everything that we see, like the most beautiful vistas in the Rocky Mountains and all of these things are like hand created by God. It's like handmade by God. And then not only that, but he owns it all, that the mountains belong to him, that the oceans belong to him, that all of it, he owns it. Even the breath in our lungs, none of it is ours. And with each of these things, it's not just as he's looking at it and as the writer of Psalms is writing this, that it's just not like an intellectual assent to the fact that God is great. It's not just like kind of a list intellectually that he understands it. You can sense as you're reading this psalm that this writer is having this kind of experience of God's greatness. It's like a visceral, existential sense, a sense that just moved him of who God is and how great he is. And so there's this, it's like the difference between seeing a picture of the Rocky Mountains, reading about it, or whatever, or going to the Rocky Mountains and having a sense of the great, experiencing it, hiking it yourself. It's like this sense, it's almost like the writer here, there's a sense where it's like the first time you see the Grand Canyon and you're just kind of thunderstruck, you're in awe, right? There's this sense where you're like, wow, and you experience how big it is and how vast it is, and then you realize that to God, that this Grand Canyon that you're looking at is tiny, it's nothing, he created it, and then there's a sense of how small you are, it just moves you. So there's a sense of awe. And when you get to that place, really, there's only a couple ways to respond, and he says that the way we should respond, in fact, he starts the whole passage off with this. He gives us this command, let us sing. Let us sing. Now, notice it doesn't say, let's come and sing together, but only if you've got a really good voice. Notice it doesn't say, come, let us sing, but only if you've got great pitch and, you're right on and you've got a great set of pipes and, you're a trained musician. It does not say that. It says nothing about it. In fact, God doesn't really care about your pitch. God cares about the fact that you're willing to give him your voice, that you're willing to sing. Now, don't get me wrong. If you can't sing, we're not going to have you on stage, Some people have a special gift to sing. You might not have that gift. But every one of us, sometimes people ask, why is the music so loud? It's so we don't have to hear ourselves sing, okay? That's right. And so, there's a reason, there's a method behind the madness here. But God is calling each one of us, and there's this sense that when we understand who it is we're singing to, that there's a response that says, come, let us sing. So that's the first section. But then the passage continues, verse 6, and it shifts in focus, and it shifts from how big God is, how great God is, and it gets personal, but how close God is. And so we want to look at this. God is personal, and that means that our response is worship, is love. God is personal, and if God's personal, that's connected to the fact that we need to love and we need to respond in love. And so verse 6 says this, come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture. We're the flock under his care. And so the second part kind of moves us from the big joyful response to kind of quiet reflection, contemplative type posture and worship. Yes, make a joyful noise. Yes, we have to shout to the Lord. Yes, we have to sing. And yes, there's big moments where we worship together, but there's also small moments. There's also intimate moments. It's a celebration, but there's also a sense of adoration in our worship. And so what moves us to this? Yes, it moves us when we understand how great God is, but there's something that shifts in our hearts when we realize that not only is God great, but our God is your God, that we are under his care. We're in his flock. He is your God. He's a personal God. He's connected to people. He's concerned with individuals and cares about each person in this room. Personally, he cares about you. And so we're the flock under his care, and he's the one guiding and directing us. And when you understand that God calls you his, there's this sense that we respond in a different way. We respond in love. And so I have to ask the question, do you understand that? Do you feel that in your heart of hearts today? Do you understand that you've been invited to a party that you had no business attending? And when you understand that, there's this response that happens. And when we get that, the only response that we can have, and it talks about this in the passage we just looked at, is to kneel down. The right response is to get down, to bow low, to kneel. Now, when it comes to kneeling in our culture, we don't really kneel all that often. It's not really part of the U.S. culture in 2023. In fact, fellas in the room, you're probably only going to get down and kneel down for 2 situations in your entire life. Whenever you propose to your fiance, number 1, right? And whenever you get down on one knee for your football photo, your team photo. Ladies in the room, I don't know if you ever have to kneel, because even in your team photos, you just do this kind of thing. I don't know what that is, but no, I'm not going to do that again. No. But most of us, culturally speaking, we don't have a reason to kneel. It's not part of our culture. We don't kneel all that often. But this passage, it says, kneel. Get down low. Get down on your face. And there's this word, shekam, which is used in the Bible 170 times. And it means to bow low, to kneel and worship. It's not just talking about the physical act. It is talking about the physical act. But there's a sense of the fact that there's a spiritual posture that's connected to that. And so often what happens is that people, when they really understand who God is, and in spiritual awakenings, you've seen this, and I've experienced this in my own life where I've seen people do this, and people that have really gotten a clear picture of who God is. And it's like the only thing they can do, the only response that makes any sense is they're compelled to kneel down, to bow down low. And oftentimes people even come up to the front of the worship service or whatever's happening, and they feel like there's no choice. They have to bow down low, and when they get a clear picture of who God is. And it's interesting. I don't think there's a single example in the scriptures where you're commanded to kneel, you're commanded to bow. It's almost just like expected. It's just kind of what happens when you really understand who it is that we're talking to, who it is that we're worshiping. When we get a clear picture of that, it's almost like it's just what's going to happen. You will kneel when you see how worthy God is. We just get to our knees. In fact, the idea of worthy and worth that we're talking about and how it's connected to worship, the word worship actually comes from this old English word, worthship. Or worth shape. It's how the worth, the value of something, shapes our lives and reorients our lives. And so this is a sense that even in the word, it's baked into the word itself and the root of the word worthship. And so that's what God does. When we see the worth that God has, when we see how worthy he is, worship is just the only natural response to that. And when we see that, when we get it and we truly understand it, we're going to bow down low. And then we realize that all of our lives, we can give all of our lives to this. And so the question is, what are you going to bow down to in your life? We all bow down to something. What are you going to bow down? What are you going to assign worth, ultimate value to? And what are you going to bow down to in your life? And most of us completely underestimate how worthy God is. Even if we can say it in our heads intellectually, we miss how worthy God is of our worship. But when we get it, our lives shift. And when we see the value of it, our lives shift. It's kind of like this, sometimes we miss the value of something, and it changes our perspective of that thing. So like there's a show that sometimes I like watching. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. The Antique Roadshow. Have you guys ever seen this show? So the Antique Roadshow, classic show. And if you aren't familiar with it, it's kind of great. People that have just like random stuff at their house, they don't know how much it's valued. Grandma gave it to me. It was passed down, whatever. We don't even really know what this thing is. And they bring these items to like an expert in antiques, and the expert will give it a value and assign it and say, hey, here's what you've got, and they understand the history of it and everything else. Well, there's this one example of a gentleman, Ted Kuntz, who had a blanket that his grandma gave him. He knew there was some like kind of history to it, Indian connection to it or whatever, but he didn't really think that much about it. And so this blanket sat on the back of his sofa for his entire life. And he brought the blanket in. It's like, Antique Roadshows here in town. Let's check out the value of the blanket. Let's see what it's worth. I don't really know. And as soon as he came in, this gentleman here started shaking. You could tell something was going on. And Ted was kind of unsure what was happening here. And this exchange is on YouTube. It's so priceless. If you have a chance, you should check it out. The appraiser looks at Ted and says, Ted, are you a wealthy man? And Ted says, no, I'm not a wealthy man. We're like farmers. We don't have anything, Well, the appraiser says, I'm still nervous here. I'm shaking even in this moment. When you walked in with this, Ted, I just about died. You have no idea what you have. And he says, no, I have no idea what I have. Well, this is a Navajo chief first phase blanket made in 1840. There's not another example like this in all of America. And this item that you have, sir, is worth $2 million. He said, and the appraiser said, you had no idea. And the guy said, I had no idea. What are you talking about? And he said, I just had it on the back of my sofa, lying on the back of my sofa for all of these years. And he said, well, you, sir, whether you realize it or not, have a national treasure worth $2 million. Congratulations, sir. So we go through life, I think, and we just have no idea. We just have no idea. We just don't see God's value. And just like this man, when we see the true value of what we have, we should be astounded. We should be thunderstruck. Tears should come down our faces. This man in this moment realized that this sofa that he had on the back, this blanket he had on the back of his sofa, it was worth so much, and he was not living in accordance with the value of the item that he had. And when he got it, it changed his entire life. He reoriented his life to the value of that thing and recalibrated his life to the value of that thing, and it changed his life. And that's what worship does. That's a picture of what worship does. It allows us to see the value, the worth of the thing that we're bowing to, the worth of God who we're giving our lives to. And so that brings us to the final one. Psalm continues. The tenor changes really in the last section. It almost gets like a warning. It gets more serious because God is holy. Yes, God is great. Yes, God is personal, but God is holy. And because God is holy, he deserves our wholehearted worship. And so it's so easy for us to miss the value of who God is. And there's this warning that happens if we miss it. And this is what the passage continues. And verse 7 says, today, if only you would hear his voice. Do not harden your hearts as you did in Meribah, as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, that they had seen what I did. For 40 years, I was angry with that generation. I said, there are people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. It's interesting that this passage turns towards a warning because, I don't know, our hearts are so fickle. It's so easy for us in one moment to get a clear picture of who God is and then forget right after that. And that's what the Israelites did again and again. They were so quick to turn. Their hearts were so fickle. And so there's this warning here. Don't let your heart be hardened. Don't harden your heart to God. It needs to be wholehearted. We need to come with everything. If God is worthy of everything, then we need to give him everything in our lives. And it shows us in this passage that worship is connected to surrender. It requires surrender. You can't worship God but refuse to surrender your will. That might be like admiration or appreciation, but it's not worship. Worship requires that we surrender our plans, our ideas, our desires, our preferences, and just say, hey, God, it's all yours. My life is yours. I'm going to bow down to you. I'm going to worship. I'm going to submit to you. And this picture of what happens, then the passage gives us a picture of what happens when we harden our hearts. It talks about Meribah and Massah. And so the psalmist is pointing back to Numbers and Exodus. And the passage refers to and talks about kind of back in the wilderness when the Israelites came up out of Egypt. And as the picture goes, you're reminded, I'm sure if you know the story, is that they were freed from captivity and slavery in Egypt, and then they got to the wilderness, and what was their response? The response was nitpicking, arguing, quarreling, complaining. They were picking at every problem that they had. They focused on every negative again and again and again. And ultimately, there was this tragedy that their hearts were hard. And because of that, it says that we will never see the rest of God. That an entire generation missed the promised land. An entire generation missed God's rest. They had seen miracles. They'd seen incredible things. They had seen the Red Sea part, and they had walked through it, and they had seen manna come from heaven. And then at the end of the day, they weren't willing to give the Lord their whole heart, and they missed it. And I just don't want us to miss it, church. I don't want us to miss it. And God led, just in the same way that God led the Israelites out of captivity and into the promised land, he wants to lead us into a promised land. He wants to lead us into something better. And what was true for them, it's true for us as well. So often we miss it. And it's because in the same way that the Israelites doubted who God was, and they doubted that God had the very best for them, we do the same thing. We kind of look at God in our lives and we think, I don't really know if God has the best in store for me. And so often we kind of have this idea, whether we are willing to say it or not, that if I really were to surrender, if I were really to bow down, if I were to really give everything to God, it would mean less for me, not more. It would mean that my life would look like less. But God is always leading us to life, not death. God is always leading us to abundance, not scarcity. God is always leading us to freedom, not bondage. He's always leading us to this rest that he has, this promise that he has, not to stress, to anxiety. And so a heart of worship is what God requires. We don't have anything else to bring. We have nothing else to give God, right? I mean, everything that we have comes from him. Every breath that we have comes from him. The mountains and the ocean shout his name. God was willing to give his son Jesus to come to live the perfect life, to die a death that we deserved, and then to find grace on the other side, to find freedom on the other side of that. And so when we look at what God has given to us, we have nothing to bring except worship. Amen. We have nothing to bring except our hearts, except our gratitude. And that's why God cares so much about worship. That's why what God takes to heart is the state of our hearts. What God takes to heart is the state of our hearts, the condition of our hearts. And that's why, more than anything else in your life today, the thing God is concerned about is your worship. More than anything else. Because it starts with worship. It's all about worship. It begins with worship. If you worship God, truly worship him, then your life is going to be right. If you worship God, your priorities are going to be right. If you worship God, your choices are going to be all right. If you worship God, you're just going to have to give up your illusion of control in your life. And finally, you can reorient your life to the only thing that has ultimate value, eternal value. In fact, I think one of the reasons that we gather here week in and week out and do this thing that we call church is that we remind each other each week of who it is that we're worshiping and why worship is so important. And if I get here and I'm struggling to worship, I look at someone else who's experiencing God and I'm reminded and I see that in them. Or maybe you see me worship and you're reminded of why worship matters so much. In fact, this entire passage, I don't think it's an accident, is not written to an individual. It's written to a community. It's written to a gathering. It says, come let us worship. Come let us sing. And so it's a community thing. It's a church thing. It's a gathering thing. It's not an individual thing. Because when God made us to worship, he made us to worship together. That's what the church is about. And so over the next couple weeks, here's my challenge, is that for the next 3 weeks, and as we move into the worship experience that's going to happen at the picnic and at the end of the month, that we wouldn't come and just kind of casually say, hey, this is just what we do on Sundays. We just kind of come, we gather, we sing a couple songs. No, that we would come to this place over the next couple weeks and we would together remind each other of how mind-boggling, how overwhelming, how breathtaking, how distinct what we're doing right now is. That we're gathering together in this place to behold the glory of God. And that we're joined together in heaven with the angels who are singing a chorus and through the saints throughout the ages to sing God's praise, to stand in awe of him and to hear him speak to us and to speak a word to each person here in this place. And so may we, in the next weeks, individually, corporately, as a church, rediscover the wonder of worship. May we be reminded and wake up to the worth of the one that we're worshiping, and then reorient our entire lives to the value of who God is. Let me pray. Lord, here we are in this place, so grateful for the fact that you are waking us up to your value, to your worth. Lord, I just pray that we would see you, experience you, know you, Lord, and that as we get a clearer picture of who you are, that we would get a sense, Lord, of what true worship looks like. Not halfway, not half-hearted, Lord, that we would bow down low, that we would sing out loud, that we would lift our hands, Lord, that we would respond in worship in a way that is compelling and moving, Lord, and that it would be a sweet, sweet smell, a sweet sight in your presence here, Lord. And so, Lord, we just thank you for who you are. We're grateful. Show us a picture of you in the next weeks. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.